Okay, how's it going, everybody? So, today we're going to read some more Karl Marx. And this is The North American Civil War, written in October 1861. Articles by Karl Marx. And this is The North American Civil War. And D-Press is what it's called, D-Press. Let's go ahead and get into this. D-Press was Marx's, his press releases. This is what would go out to, different, different, different press companies, basically different media companies. One of them being the New York Tribune in the United States, which was the most distributed newspaper in the United States at the time. And also, he was hired on there as the British correspondent by somebody who eventually went on to be Lincoln's cabinet advisor on his generals. So let's go ahead and get into this. This is London, October 20th, 1861. Let's go ahead and get into this. North American Civil War. For months, the leading weekly and daily papers of the London press have been reiterating the same litany on the American Civil War. While they insult the free states of the North, they anxiously defend themselves against the suspicion of sympathizing with the slave states of the South. In fact, they continually write two articles. One article in which they attack the North, and another article in which they excuse their attacks on the North. In essence, the extenuating arguments read. So this is what he's saying. This is basically what they keep saying. The war between the North and the South is a tariff war. The war is, further, not for any principle, does not touch the question of slavery, and in fact turns on Northern lust for sovereignty. Finally, even if justice is on the side of the North, does it not remain a vain endeavor to want to subjugate 8 million Anglo-Saxons by force? Would not separation of the South release the North from all connection with slavery and ensure for it, with its 20 million inhabitants and its vast territory, a higher hitherto scarcely dreamt of development? Accordingly, must not the North welcome secession as a happy event, instead of wanting to overrule it by a bloody and futile civil war? So this is going back to Marx. He said that was basically he's summarizing what the British press keeps saying over and over again. So he says, point by point, we will probe the plea of the English press. The war between North and South, so runs the first excuse, is a mere tariff war, a war between a protectionist system and a free trade system. And Britain naturally stands on the side of free trade. Shall the slave owner enjoy the fruits of slave labor in their entirety, or shall he be cheated of a portion of these by the protectionists of the North? That is the question which is at issue in this war. It was reserved for the Times to make this brilliant discovery. The Economist, the Examiner, the Saturday Review, and Tutti Quanti expounded the theme further. It is characteristic of this discovery that it was made not in Charleston but in London. Naturally, in America, everyone knew that from 1846 to 1861, a free trade system prevailed, and that Representative Morrill carried his protectionist tariff through Congress only in 1861, after the rebellion had already broken out. Secession, therefore, did not take place because the Morrill tariff had gone through Congress, but, at most, the Morrill tariff went through Congress because secession had taken place. When South Carolina had its first attack of secession in 1831, the protectionist tariff of 1828 served it, to be sure, as a pretext, but only as a pretext, as is known from a statement of General Jackson. This time, however, the old pretext has in fact not been repeated. In the secession Congress at Montgomery, all reference to the tariff question was avoided, because the cultivation of sugar in Louisiana, one of the most influential southern states, depends entirely on protection. But the London press pleads further. The war of the United States is nothing but a war for the forcible maintenance of the Union. The Yankees cannot make up their minds to strike 15 stars from their standard. They want to cut a colossal figure on the world stage. Yes, it would be different if the war was waged for the abolition of slavery. The question of slavery, however, the Saturday Review categorically declares, among other things, has absolutely nothing to do with this war. It is above all to be remembered that the war did not originate with the North, but with the South. The North finds itself on the defensive. For months it had quietly looked on while the secessionists appropriated the Union's forts, arsenals, shipyards, custom houses, pay office, ships, and supplies of arms, insulted its flag, and took prisoner bodies of its troops. Finally, the secessionists resolved to force the Union government out of its passive attitude by a blatant act of war, and solely for this reason proceeded by the bombardment of Fort Sumter near Charleston. On April 11, 1861, their General Beauregard had learnt it in a meeting with Major Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter, that the fort was only supplied with provisions for 3 days more, and accordingly must be peacefully surrendered after this period. In order to forestall this peaceful surrender, the secessionists opened the bombardment early on the following morning, April 12, which brought about the fall of the fort in a few hours. News of this had hardly been telegraphed to Montgomery, the seat of the Secession Congress, when War Minister Walker publicly declared, in the name of the new Confederacy, "No man can say where the war opened today will end." At the same time, he prophesied that before the 1st of May, the flag of the Southern Confederacy will wave from the dome of the old Capitol in Washington, and within a short time, perhaps also from the Faneuil Hall in Boston. Only now ensued the proclamation in which Lincoln called for 75,000 men to defend the Union. The bombardment of Fort Sumter cut off the only possible constitutional way out, namely the convocation of a general convention of the American people, as Lincoln had proposed in his inaugural address. For Lincoln, there now remained only the choice of fleeing from Washington, evacuating Maryland and Delaware, and surrendering Kentucky, Missouri, and Virginia, or of answering war with war. The question of the principle of the American Civil War is answered by the battle slogan with which the South broke the peace. Stevens, the vice president of the Southern Confederacy, declared in the Secession Congress that what essentially distinguished the Constitution newly hatched at Montgomery from the Constitution of Washington and Jefferson was that now, the first time, slavery was recognized as an institution good in itself, and as the foundation of the whole state edifice. Whereas the Revolutionary Fathers, men steeped in the prejudices of the 18th century, had treated slavery as an evil imported from England, and to be eliminated in the course of time. Another matador of the South, Mr. Spratt, cried out, quote, "For us it is a question of founding a great slave republic," end quote. If, therefore, it was indeed only in defense of the Union that the North drew the sword, had not the South already declared that the continuance of slavery was no longer compatible with the continuance of the Union? Just as the bombardment of Fort Sumter gave the signal for the opening of the war, the election victory of the Republican Party of the North, the election of Lincoln as president, gave the signal for secession. On November 6, 1860, Lincoln was elected. On November 8, 1860, a message telegraphed from South Carolina said secession is regarded here as an accomplished fact. On November 10th, the legislature of Georgia occupied itself with secession plans, and on November 13th, a special session of the legislature of Mississippi was convened to consider secession. But Lincoln's election was itself only the result of a split in the Democratic camp. During the election struggle, the Democrats of the North concentrated their votes on Douglas. The Democrats of the South concentrated their votes on Breckinridge. And to this splitting of the Democratic votes, the Republican Party owed its victory. Whence came on the one hand the preponderance of the Republican Party in the North, whence on the other the disunion within the Democratic Party, whose members, North and South, had operated in conjunction for more than half a century. Under the presidency of Buchanan, the sway that the South had gradually usurped over the Union through its alliance with the Northern Democrats attained its zenith. The last Continental Congress of 1787 and the first Constitutional Congress of 1789 through 90 had legally excluded slavery from all territories of the Republic northwest of the Ohio. Territories, as is known, is the name given to the colonies lying within the United States itself, which have not yet attained the level of population constitutionally prescribed for the formation of autonomous states. The so-called Missouri Compromise in 1820, in consequence of which Missouri became one of the states of the Union as a slave state, excluded slavery from every remaining territory north of 36 degrees latitude and west of the Missouri. By this compromise, the area of slavery was advanced several degrees of longitude, whilst on the other hand, a geographical boundary lying to its future spread seemed quite definitely drawn. This geographical barrier, in its turn, was thrown down in 1854 by the so-called Kansas-Nebraska Bill, the initiator of which was Stephen A. Douglas, then leader of the Northern Democrats. The bill, which passed both House of Congresses, repealed the Missouri Compromise, placed slavery and freedom on the same footing, commanded the Union government to treat them both with equal indifference, and left it to the sovereignty of the people, that is, the majority of the settlers, to decide whether or not slavery was to be introduced in a territory. Thus, for the first time in the history of the United States, every geographical and legal limit to the extension of slavery in the territories was removed. Under this new legislation, the hitherto free territory of New Mexico, a territory 5 times as large as the state of New York, was transformed into a slave territory, and the area of slavery was extended from the border of the Mexican Republic to 38 degrees north latitude. In 1859, New Mexico received a slave code that vies with the statute books of Texas and Alabama in barbarity. Nevertheless, as the census of 1860 proves, among some 100,000 inhabitants, New Mexico does not yet count half 100 slaves. It had therefore sufficed for the South to send some adventurers with a few slaves over the border, and then, with the help of the central government in Washington and its officials and contractors in New Mexico, to drum together a sham popular representation to impose slavery, and with it the rule of the slaveholders on the territory. However, this convenient method did not prove applicable in other territories. The South, accordingly, went a step further and appealed from Congress to the Supreme Court of the United States. This court, which numbers 9 judges, 5 of whom belonged to the South, had long been the most willing tool of the slaveholders. It decided in 1857 in the notorious Dred Scott case that every American citizen possesses the right to take with him into any territory any property recognized by the Constitution. The Constitution, it maintained, recognizes slaves as property and obliges the Union government to protect this property. Consequently, on the basis of the Constitution, slaves could be forced to labor in the territories by their owners, and so every individual slaveholder was entitled to introduce slavery into hitherto free territories against the will of the majority of the settlers. The right to exclude slavery was taken from the territorial legislatures, and the duty to protect pioneers of the slave system was imposed on Congress and the Union government. If the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had extended the geographical boundary line of slavery in the territories, if the Kansas-Nebraska Bill of 1854 had erased every geographical boundary line and set up a political barrier instead, the will of the majority of the settlers, now the Supreme Court of the United States, by its decision of 1857, tore down even this political barrier and transformed all the territories of the Republic, present and future, from nurseries of free states into nurseries of slavery. At the same time, under Buchanan's government, the severe law on the surrendering of fugitive slaves enacted in 1850 was ruthlessly carried out in the states of the North. To play the part of slave catchers for the Southern slaveholders appeared to be the constitutional calling of the North. On the other hand, in order to hinder as far as possible the colonization of the territories by free settlers, the slaveholders' party frustrated all the so-called free soil measures, i.e., measures which were to secure for the settlers a definite amount of uncultivated land free of charge. In the foreign, as in the domestic, policy of the United States, the interests of slaveholders served as the gilding star. Buchanan had in fact bought the office of the president through the issue of the Austin Manifesto, in which the acquisition of Cuba, whether by purchase or by force of arms, was proclaimed as the great task of national policy. Under his government, northern Mexico was already divided among American land speculators who impatiently awaited the signal to fall in Chihuahua, Coahuila, and Sonora. The unceasing piratical expeditions of the filibusters against the states of Central America were directed no less from the White House at Washington, in the closest connection with this foreign policy, whose manifest purpose was conquest of new territory for the spread of slavery. In the slaveholders' rule stood the reopening of the slave trade, secretly supported by the Union government. Stephen A. Douglas himself declared in the American Senate on August 20th, 1859, quote, "During the last year more black people have been imported from Africa than ever before in any single year, even at the time when the slave trade was still legal. The number of slaves imported in the last year totaled 15,000. Arms spreading of slavery abroad was the avowed aim of national policy. The Union had in fact become the slave of the 300,000 slaveholders who held sway over the South. A series of compromises, which the South owed to its alliance with the Northern Democrats, had led to this result. On this alliance, all the attempts periodically repeated since 1817 to resist the ever-increasing encroachment of the slaveholders had hitherto come to grief. At length there came a turning point. For hardly had the Kansas-Nebraska bill gone through, which wiped the geographical boundary line of slavery and made its introduction into the new territory subject to the will of the majority of the settlers, when armed emissaries of the slaveholders, border rabble from Missouri and Arkansas, with bowie knife in one hand and revolver in the other, fell upon Kansas and sought by the most unheard of atrocities to dislodge its settlers from the territory colonized by them. These raids were supported by the central government in Washington, hence a tremendous reaction. Throughout the North, but particularly in the Northwest, a relief organization was formed to support Kansas with men, arms, and money. Out of this relief organization arose the Republican Party, which therefore owes its origins to the struggle for Kansas. After the attempt to transform Kansas into a slave territory by force of arms had failed, the South sought to achieve the same result by political intrigues. Buchanan's government in particular exerted its utmost effort to have Kansas included into the states of the Union as a slave state, with a slave constitution imposed on it. Hence renewed struggle, this time mainly conducted in Congress at Washington. Even Stephen A. Douglas, the chief of the Northern Democrats, now 1857 through 58, entered the list against the government and his allies of the South, because imposition of a slave constitution would have been contrary to the principle of sovereignty of the settlers passed in Nebraska Bill of 1854. Douglas, senator for Illinois, a northwestern state, would naturally have lost all his influence if he had wanted to concede to the South the right to steal by force of arms or through the acts of Congress territories colonized by the North. As the struggle for Kansas, therefore, called the Republican Party into being, it at the same time occasioned the first split within the Democrat Party itself. The Republican Party put forward its first platform for the presidential election in 1856. Although its candidate, John Fremont, was not victorious, the huge number of votes cast for him at any rate proved the rapid growth of the party, particularly in the Northwest. At their second national convention for the presidential election, May 17, 1860, the Republicans again put forward their platform of 1856, only enriched by some additions. Its principal contents were the following: not a foot of fresh territory is further conceded to slavery. The filibustering policy abroad must cease. The reopening of the slave trade is stigmatized. Finally, free soil laws are to be enacted for the furtherance of free colonization. The vitally important point in this platform was not that a foot of fresh terrain was ceded to slavery, rather it was to remain once and for all confined within the boundaries of the states where it already legally existed. Slavery was thus to be formally interned, but continual expansion of territory and continual spread of slavery beyond its old limits is a law of life for the slave states of the Union. The cultivation of the southern export articles, cotton, tobacco, sugar, etc., carried on by slaves, is only remunerative as long as it's conducted with large gangs of slaves on a mass scale and on wide expanses of a naturally fertile soil, which requires only simple labor. Intensive cultivation, which depends on less fertility of the soil than on investment of capital, intelligence, and energy of labor, is contrary to the nature of slavery. Hence the rapid transformation of states like Maryland and Virginia, which formerly employed slaves in the production of export articles, into states which raised slaves to export them into the deep South. Even in South Carolina, where the slaves form 4/7 of the population, the cultivation of cotton has been completely stationary for years due to the exhaustion of the soil. Indeed, by force of circumstances, South Carolina has already been transformed in part into a slave-raising state, since it already sells slaves to the sum of $4 million yearly to the states of the extreme South and the Southwest. As soon as this point is reached, the acquisition of new territories becomes necessary, so that one section of the slaveholders with their slaves may occupy new fertile lands, and that a new market for slave raising, therefore the sale of slaves, may be created for the remaining section. It is, for example, indubitable that without the acquisition of Louisiana, Missouri, and Arkansas by the United States, slavery in Virginia and Maryland would have been wiped out long ago. In the secessionist Congress at Montgomery, Senator Toombs, one of the spokesmen of the South, strikingly formulated the economic law that commands the constant expansion of the territory of slavery. Quote, in 15 years, end quote, quote, without a great increase in slave territory, either the slaves must be permitted to flee from the whites, or the whites must flee from the slaves, end quote. As is known, the representation of the individual states in the Congress House of Representatives depends on the size of their respective populations. As the populations of the free states grow far more quickly than those of the slave states, the number of northern representatives was bound to outstrip that of the southern very rapidly. The real seat of the political power of the South is accordingly transferred more and more to the American Senate, where every state, whether its population is great or small, is represented by 2 senators. In order to assert its influence in the Senate and through the Senate, its hegemony over the United States, the South therefore required a continual formation of new slave states. This, however, was only possible through conquest of foreign lands, as in the case of Texas, or through the transformation of territories belonging to the United States, first into slave territories, and later into slave states, as in the case of Missouri, Arkansas, etc. John Calhoun, whom the slaveholders admire as their statesman par excellence, stated as early as February 19, 1847, in the Senate that the Senate alone placed a balance of power in the hands of the South, that extension of the slave territory was necessary to preserve the equilibrium between South and North in the Senate, and that the attempts of the South at the creation of new slave states by force were accordingly justified. Finally, the number of actual slaveholders in the South of the Union does not amount to more than 300,000. A narrow oligarchy that is confronted with many millions of so-called poor whites, whose numbers have been constantly growing through concentration of landed property, and whose condition is only to be compared with that of the Roman plebeians in the period of Rome's extreme decline. Only by acquisition and the prospect of acquisition of new territories, as well as filibustering expeditions, is it possible to square the interests of these poor whites with those of the slaveholders, to give their restless thirst for action a harmless direction, and to tame them with the prospect of one day becoming slaveholders themselves. A strict confinement of slavery within its old terrain, therefore, was bound according to economic law to lead to its gradual effacement in the political sphere, to annihilate the hegemony that the slave states exercised through the Senate, and finally to expose the slaveholding oligarchy within its own states the threatening perils from the poor whites. In accordance with the principle that any further extension of the slave territories was to be prohibited by law, the Republicans therefore attacked the rule of the slaveholders as its root. The Republican election victory was accordingly bound to lead to open struggle between North and South, and this election victory, as already mentioned, was itself conditioned by the split in the Democratic camp. The Kansas struggle had already caused a split between the slaveholders party and the Democrats of the North allied to it. With the presidential election of 1860, the same strife now broke out again in a more general form. The Democrats of the North, with Douglas as their candidate, made the introduction of slavery into territories dependent on the will of the majority of the settlers. The slaveholders' party, with Breckinridge as their candidate, maintained that the Constitution of the United States, as the Supreme Court had also declared, brought slavery legally in its train. In and of itself, slavery was already legal in all territories and required no special naturalization. Whilst, therefore, the Republicans prohibited any extension of slave territories, the Southern Party laid claim to all territories of the Republic as legally warranted domains. What they had attempted by way of example with regard to Kansas, to force slavery on a territory through the central government against the will of the settlers themselves, they now set up as law for all territories of the Union. Such a concession lay beyond the power of the Democratic leaders. It would only have occasioned the desertion of their army to the Republican camp. On the other hand, Douglas settlers' sovereignty could not satisfy the slaveholders' party. What it wanted to effect had to be effected within the next 4 years under the new president, could only be effected by the resources of the central government, and brooked no further delay. It did not escape the slaveholders that a new power had arisen, the Northwest, whose population, having almost doubled between 1850 and 1860, was already pretty well equal to the white population of the slave states. A power that was not inclined either by tradition, temperament, or mode of life to let itself be dragged from compromise to compromise in the matter of the old northeastern states. The Union was still of value to the South only so far as it handed over federal power to it as means of carrying out the slave policy. If not, then it was better to make the break now than to look on at the development of the Republican Party and the upsurge of the Northwest for another 4 years, and begin the struggle under more favorable conditions. The slaveholders' party therefore played va-banque. When the Democrats of the North declined to go on playing the part of the poor whites of the South secured Lincoln's victory by splitting the vote, and then took this victory as a pretext for drawing the sword from the scabbard. The whole movement was and is based, as one sees, on the slave question, not in the sense whether the slaves within the existing slave states should be emancipated outright or not, but whether the 20 million free men of the North should submit any longer to an oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders, whether the vast territories of the Republic should be nurseries or free states for free states or for slavery. Finally, whether the national policy of the Union should take arms spreading of slavery in Mexico, Central, and South America as its device. In another article, we will probe the assertion of the London press that the North must sanction secession as the most favorable and only possible solution of the conflict. Okay, well, thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium, all of these are Marxist. Y'all hit me up there. You got to hear Marx talk about Arkansas. That was pretty cool. So yeah, y'all hit me up there, and y'all have a great day. And do that,